everyone and welcome back. Today I want to go over the breakdown of the SKYWARD project Karsten and I did for the CG Lounge Environment Challenge. I just want to give you a quick overview, all the challenges we faced and how we actually made this whole project come together. As you can see, there are lots of moving pieces in it. The first thing I want to talk about is how did we actually collaborate, because that is a challenge in itself, because I'm actually in Vancouver and Karsten is somewhere in Germany. We had to find a good way where we can actually work together seamlessly without any hiccups in uploads or sharing assets or whatever. We had a couple of prerequisites we had to do. One was obviously where are we hosting our stuff and how can we actually work together. So we decided to use Dropbox for our file sharing. So we both share a folder, a unique folder, and we both work from that same directory to make sure we can actually open HIP files from each other, because Dropbox has obviously its local path, which is local to your machine. We had to find a way to actually use a variable that we can apply. So everything we share within is actually relative to the project directory. So we ended up doing a variable. We named it SKYWARD. This is, we are setting this actually on when we launching the scene file, the Houdini session, we are setting it right there. So whenever we reference something, so if I would now do, I don't know, a file read or something like that, you will notice if we put $SKYWARD in here, this will resolve to our project directory. And this is obviously local to my machine, and Karsten has its own location. So this is how we were able to manage all the file sharing. And the cool thing is we are both working on Linux. We have our Dropbox service installed. That means whenever I save a file, whenever I do anything, essentially, it saves it locally to my machine, and then it will upload to Dropbox, it will sync, and Karsten in Germany will get a update as well. And that's a very cool way to share things. So obviously, to make things quick and nice to work, we had to make sure our scene files were kept small. We are not essentially storing anything, which makes the HIP files big. So that was a prerequisite. And then obviously everything needs to be cached to disk and then read as a file read or BGSEO or Alembic or whatever we had. So that was the story about collaboration. And then the next story is how did we actually split the work? And that was a challenge in itself, because obviously there are so many cool things to do. And Karsten is specializing in simulation and all of that stuff. So I wanted for him to pick what he wanted to do, and I essentially did the rest. So he, in the end, decided to do the simulation of most elements. So he did the hero water. And yeah, so this was roughly where we split the work. And I want to go over the things I did on this project. So I essentially everything what is on the main island, roughly. So I did the bridges, the pathways, the trees, the water surfaces which are moving here, the spray waterfalls, we will go over everything. I did the simulations on the hanging vines, not on the bridge. I think the final version, Karsten did the vines on the bridge, but essentially it's just lines and then a vellum sim with some pop forces on it. We placed a couple of birds. Karsten actually had some cool rig for these foreground birds where you can actually see the wings flapping. And there are also birds in the far distance, which I did, which are essentially just cubes flying. I will show you that as well. And that is the whole idea. So we actually figured out a way to share things nicely. And then we both had our HIP files where we worked in. And in this HIP file, I do reference a couple of Karsten's caches, especially for the islands, because I had to use his work to actually scatter the trees and the buildings and all of that. So we did collaborate quite a lot. And then obviously I'm working in my env proxy file. It's a little bit dated, that name. This scene here is my working file, and then my render file essentially loads in all the stuff, because I render with Deadline. I've got a couple of small render nodes here which help me render that. So I need to actually export everything to AS files so I can render it seamlessly with Arnold. And yeah, that's a different story, but I will just go about the Houdini stuff. So this is the scene setup, my main working scene. And this will also be available to my Patreons, which I first of all want to thank for your continued support on Patreon. You will get full access to the scenes. I will not provide the caches. You need to, if you want to, you need to cache the things out yourself, because it's just too heavy to share. It's like the whole project file was, I think, 400 gigabytes. So obviously this will not be available, but you get all the the building blocks to just recache it out yourself. All right, so I'm not even sure where to start. I think a cool thing is essentially the look dev, right? So we started out with one simple building. So if I frame it, this is now my look dev building, and we imported the shaders from a kitbash scene. So this is a kitbash asset. I did not do the modeling or anything like that. So we just found a way to easily import the material networks into Houdini. And then I did some subtle overrides, like just spice up the materials, right, to make them look nicer. So I did some triplanar texture, like some grunges on all of that. So if I go to the render view now, you will see this is now our look dev environment. And it's quite easy to adjust. Obviously, the things you would change is like changing roughness maps, changing base color maps, just to make it a little bit more grungy, because the defaults were pretty pristine and clean. Was to using Arnold operators. And Arnold operators are a little bit black boxy. It's a little bit tricky to know what you need to do. So let me just explain what the idea was. Our imported Let's actually go back. Our imported materials are like, we've got a lot for this kitbash asset, right? And I didn't feel that I had the time to actually go to each of these nodes and do things manually, change roughness on this, change maybe a bump map value on that and this. So I wanted to find a way where I can just do it globally, and it would just go in those networks and do it for me. And to the rescue comes Arnold operators. There are a couple. I think it's called, I'm not sure it's not really under operator itself, but it's probably under Arnold somewhere. Set parameter transform. So these are all operators here, which you can use, and I'm using a set parameter a couple of times, and you can see it operates on certain node names and types. So if the node is a standard surface, do something with it. If the name is blah 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 standard surface, do something with it. And then what I'm doing is I'm just making it a little bit more specular. So I'm changing the IOR. And then the other one is I'm setting the roughness value. So I'm making everything a little bit more rough and not so specky. Also, I'm changing on the image node the color, and I'm just darkening it down. So this is actually traversing over every node it finds that is an image node, and it has a color in the name. And there's also, you can use kick. Yeah, so actually to list the values which are actually available for you, so you would go kick dash nodes. This will print you all the available Arnold nodes. And then if you want to see the parameters, you could, for instance, go kick dash info, and then you would provide the node. And I know it's an image node, and then it will tell you, okay, the parameter name is called color or color space or whatever. And I'm using, for instance, a multiply, which is down here, which is a vector. And then this is how I actually knew what to do with this. So this is how I roughly did the look dev, right? I didn't want to do it manual. I did it globally. So and also it comes a little bit into importance is how close are you to the assets. Next up is probably a cool thing. How did we do the vines and the trees and all of that as well? And let me just jump into the foliage scatter, or the main network box where we did all the scattering of all the trees. I have the SpeedTree importer, which is a basic HDA, which is not very crazy. It's an early version of our SpeedTree importer that is actually now available on Gumroad. So this was the early test, which is available in the scene if you want to play with this. In the end, what's going on is you point it to a file. It has to be a SpeedTree asset with a certain amount of parameters. You can see these are all exported here on the right. And then it just imports it. And I exported a couple of trees from SpeedTree with these spines and all of that. And I just loaded them in as my tree variants, right? These are the ones that I placed on the origin, and these were made available to copy. And a similar thing, I have like a little grass thingy. It's just this, it's nothing more. And I use the exploded view to actually just make it a little bit wider. So it's nothing crazy what this stuff is, right? And how I go about it is bring in my geometry where I want to scatter things on. And then I loop over everything and I do some remeshing. I don't want to scatter on this detail mesh, so I'm actually creating a bound. I'm remeshing the bound, and then I'm raying it back down onto the geo, and then I'm blasting whatever I don't want, clean it up, do a group of that, do a compile block so it's nice and quick. And then you can see now all of these are now the RAID remashed boxes onto my island pieces, essentially. That is the main starting point. So from here on, I need to figure out a nice way to actually scatter the trees on it. And obviously these nodes, I just didn't know, okay, I need to do this to get me to the end result. All of these nodes are after like a long trial and error phase, right? So what do I need here? Okay, let me grab all the mask. Like I want to create a mask right on the outside. So I'm picking all the outside points and I'm creating a mask from that. The visualization just doesn't work. I had matcap on and that doesn't work. Unfortunately, it took me time to figure that out. But anyways, if you go back to smooth shaded, now you can see that I created this group for the outside and then I'm just doing mask along geometry. I'm picking my start points and then I do have a radius to just kind of fade off the edges. So I don't want to have trees growing on these edges, right? That was the main idea behind this. And then I'm also driving the P scale, which is the P scale is essentially the scale per point, which I'm scattering. And also I'm kind of fading them down towards the edges so they are a little bit smaller. I'm not sure. I just thought it's a good idea to do that. Then I'm doing some cleanups here. Geo, what's going on here? That's my VDB. I'm just grouping points for foreground and background assets. Sorry, for foreground and background cliffs. So you can see now I'm just doing a main group, and because I had at some point to art direct it a little bit, so this is a scatter mask for the points. So I'm just scattering things which are not in that group. So this is my scatter mask, which will drive in the end where points will be generated. I bring in the buildings to remove, like it's a VDB, and to remove where trees will be growing. So I'm bringing them in. I'm doing a building group. I'm creating a no scatter group, which looks like this. And then I bring in the pathways as well, because I don't want to have trees growing on concrete. So I'll bring those in too. And then, let's see. And then that's roughly it. So this is my mask then in the end. So I'm subtracting one from the other. And then there is no growing anymore. You can see this is essentially my map, which removes my growth points. And then the cool thing is the scatter line node. I think it was introduced in version 18.5 or so. Let me just switch back to points so they are a little bit bigger. And you can see this is now where my trees are being scattered. And we can always adjust things if we need to, like, the density, the scale. I'll show that in a second. I'm creating a random height as well. So between 0.65 and 1.5, this is my random tree size. And you can see a couple, based on the ramp, a couple are actually getting really big. I'm using a point relax to just move them out a little so they're not just too close together. And you can provide a geo so it actually does it in 3D space. I'm splitting it here based on the midground foreground groups. So this is my foreground, and then this is my this is my foreground, and these are my background trees. So what's going on here? Also very cool, actually. In this variant adjustment thing, I can specify based on an attribute how much percent I want that certain type of tree in my scatter points. And I'm creating this it's just an integer adjust, but if you go down to specific values, and then you can actually create these weights, right? As you can see, and I'm just naming them variants. And you can see now, based on my color coding in the viewport, this is now how much this certain species is in the tree. And all of this is driven by a noise, so I can just offset it. And the cool thing about noise is it essentially creates a grouping by default. And then the next cool node is attribute from pieces. You will notice that this has an input, and the input is my original trees. And what it's doing, it's just extracting the name, because each tree has its unique name. And based on the name, you can see I'm putting them in here. And the mapping attribute is the one we just created before, the variant, which is this one. And then based on that attribute, it will put this tree name onto that point, if that makes sense. And I have all these like I've got 4 variations of each tree species, and then they get randomly placed onto those points. So if I would present the name attribute now in the viewer, So this is now based on the name, right? So that's also quite cool. And also based on the name, I'm just scaling certain trees to be bigger. So this is just art directing things, right? And at the bottom, this is now my exported point group, which is also the ones I use for the final render. These are my trees as well, my scatter trees. And I can just copy to points them, and then you'll see exactly what's going on. And yes, the Houdini is smart enough to kind of cull around a polygon limit. You can kind of go around it if you just increase this, but your scene's going to obviously freeze or crash if you go too crazy with this number. But sometimes you just want that to actually see all the instances in your scene. And you notice that we got a couple of really big trees and then smaller trees. And that is just what I said. It's about art directing it. And if we want, for instance, now one species to be more dominant, we can just increase its weight, and then everything you can see now we get way more of this species. But I wanted those dry, dead looking ones just to be very rare and subtle. And this is the way I was able to really be flexible about it and art direct it. So that is roughly the whole idea of this. So bringing in the geo from SpeedTree, wherever you have your trees, and then optimizing the geo at the top, and then doing your masking. Then you do your scatter points, then you do your p-scale adjustments, your variant based on name, and then everything is just copied to points. And in the end, directly like this. So how I, in the end, did render group, and you can see I'm loading in the same points as I just showed you, but I'm doing the instancing in a wrangle. This just allows me to, if I would need to offset, because we actually in the end had animations for the trees. They are not static. So you will notice that in my instance file, if I go all the way to the right, you'll see that based on the frame, the as file is actually being replaced. So it's actually loading a different as file per frame. And that allows us to actually animate the trees. So before I forget, I just wanted to show as well actually how we animated those trees. So we're using the SpeedTree importer here, and all of this is based on a top network, and the top network is getting all my trees from disk. So if I generate this node, it will show you, okay, I've got 16 trees, 4 variations for each species, right? So that's kind of what it's doing. It's setting a tree path here. If I generate that as well, and I click this, you will see that the trees are actually being exchanged here on the left. So it's actually loading a different tree from disk. And let's just find a good one, which we can actually show you the animation. You can see, and this here at the bottom is just generating the Alembic files on disk. And that's the top net. So if I just generate this now, this will make all the connections on the SpeedTree importer. And this obviously will not be shared because this is our HGA that you can get on Gumroad. The link is in the description, as I said. And this is importing this tree. And then I am loading in the branches. And already here you can see generated skeleton. And based off that, I can like animate them. You can see if I change the sway strength, you can now see that it really starts to move a lot. Obviously, it's way exaggerated. And then you can add another branch level. So we're going one level deeper. And then we are animating kind of the branches itself and not the trunk anymore. And then there's another step to actually go one level lower, and then it's just kind of more the leaf clusters which are then animated. And all of that, here's another level, even lower. So I went all out here to animate each individual branch as well. And towards the end here, there's a deformer going on. So this then brings the animation onto the main tree. And then at the base here, you have the leaves as well. That will show you the animation on the tree, on the leaves. And I can freeze the tree anim just to quickly see how the wind would affect the leaves itself, because they are wobbling individually as well. And you can obviously animate them with the breakup noise. You can see, I know it's hard to see, but everything is dancing here if I change those values. And the same with the speed and amount. So now everything is moving. And it's just a quick way to just see the individual leaf animation, and then you can unfreeze the tree. These two output nodes, as I said, they are going into this top network. And then here I'm fetching the Alembic ROPs and then they are being written out to disk. All of the whole project is essentially based on topnets, just to automate the process for us not to do everything manually. So everything is based on that. All right, so now let's have a look at the buildings, I would say. Buildings, also quite interesting, very simple. It's maybe unfortunate for you, but it's a third-party plugin which is actually doing these vines. But first, let me talk about the placement. So you might be wondering, how did I place these exactly where I wanted them to go? So I brought in my island, my geometry for the island, like this. I control-click the template icon so they're always visible. And then it's pretty easy. I just created an add node. I use copy to points. I used an add node. And let's say I got the node from Carsten or whoever. Let's add another of these buildings right there. So I can just fairly quickly create a new point, open up the manipulator for that point. I think I need to make this current operator, and then you can already see all the points. And now it's quite easy for me. I can just move the point and I can snap it using X point snapping. And then, okay, it's now, I'm not sure why, there you go. Why it didn't snap just now, but you can then snap it right onto the geo. So it's very easy, and you can obviously look through the render camera and do the same kind of spiel again if you want to place it exactly here. And this is how I were able to place things very quickly and an easy way in Houdini. You don't need to deal with transforms and all of that. Just make sure they are packed. It's a single point you're moving, and then it's fairly quick and easy to place buildings and do whatever you need to do. I've got random rotations on them. I did that for all these buildings. And now let's have a look at the Ivy section. I have one building brought in. So the MC Ivy, this is the third party, and you will get an affiliate link to this in the link below. So if you sign up for that, you're obviously helping me and helping the author. This has been used on the Last of Us series. So they used MC Ivy Taming as well for all the Ivy growth and all of that on the show. So it's a very powerful plugin. I'm scattering points onto my mesh, and then these are my seed points essentially, and based off those, the ivy is just generated, and it's just super easy to do. And you can see it brings you everything with it. And you can also, in the end, what I actually did, I just used the lines because we are so far away. I didn't need to do all the leaves. You can do obviously a lot. Based off this, you can then control how long they grow. You can see if I increase the iterations, we get just a lot more ivy on it, and it's really cool. And we can also add more instance points, and then we get even more from the get-go, right? So if I now have 15, it starts to get really overgrown, and you can play obviously with all these settings in here to really make it work the way you want. And then I use the same copy to points. So I'm essentially just copying the same vines onto these same buildings. So because they are randomly rotated, which the copy to points respects because there's an orient on it, they still look kind of random. And that's what I did for all of these guys. And then in the end, we had all these vines. Merge everything together with the buildings. And then this is obviously the result and how we rendered that in the end. All right, so now let's have a look under pathways. This is the most simple thing I ever did, I believe. It's just creating bridges and pathways. This HDA, I have the same surface here at the top. I'm using a draw curve to just paint where I think based on the camera view where I wanted to have pathways. And then this HDA just does them for me, right? It's very simple. If you dive in here, it's a couple of nodes, resampling it, transferring attributes, raining stuff onto the base geo, sweeping it. So it's honestly very simple stuff. And then, yeah, I have a couple of modes. We can do like separated tracks if we want that, or a solid surface. You can change the width of them. All of that is a little bit adjustable. So doing HDAs for these kind of things is perfect. And then how did we do the ivy on the pathways? Same way, I created a VDB version of the pathways, and then it will create me the vines. And it's also very straightforward, and the result is just so much better with that amount of detail. The bridges is another HDA I did. And so if I would copy this HDA, I can hit enter. This will give me a 2-point option to pick and place points. So I can just either snap them. So if I do the same way as with the buildings, I can just place them where I think we need another bridge. And then the bridge is kind of automatically being placed. I can play with all these values. I can offset the bottom one or the top one to create exactly that kind of bridge I want. Add more pieces to this. You can add more segments at the bottom, make them wider. So it's quite customizable, and it's just something I wanted to do for this project. So they live within the project, these HDAs, and you can have a look if you want to play with them. You can also just dive in here how this is being done. So let's see what else we can talk about. Well, let's just first talk about this. This seems quite complex, and the setup for this is a little bit complicated. We've got wedges, so we have several pieces, and the thing is, for Vellum, I didn't want to kind of sim them in world space. I wanted kind of to sim them in the origin, right? So I had to figure out a way to do this in a smart way, and I'll try to go over the steps here. We're bringing in the geo. I'm unpacking the piece. You can see now we have access to everything. I'm doing a low-res version at the top here. Settings are normal. Setting density attributes on this. So if I visualize the density, let me go remove the matte cap shading. Keeps tripping me up. So the density is essentially a height, and it's showing me where I want to scatter points from which these vines grow off of, right? So I'm using a height remap attribute. Where is actually the height being set? I'm actually setting the height up here. I'm reading the height from the surface attribute into my mesh, and then I'm using that in the end down here to generate that. Before, what I did, before it was written onto the geo itself, it's also quite easy to do. If I create the height attribute here, you can just change it to bounding box and have it on the y-axis, and then you can kind of have the same kind of look. The only thing what you then obviously would need to do is kind of shape it, and then you can kind of get roughly the same idea. So the only difference here is we had this now on the point attributes, which we then used instead. So in the scatter node, it's based on density. So wherever it's 1 or high, we get more points, and that's the idea. From there on, we are just setting a unique ID per point, so it's based on PT number. So now what I did here, I created 2 points, like a copy of the original points, and they are just pointing away. So this is looks a little bit odd, but this is now how it looks with the offset angle and the offset itself. And this is just pointing them outwards. So when I start the Vellum sim, they will nicely fold around the geo. That was the idea. And then I've got I'm doing like this low-res geo. And then based on that, I'm just selecting every vine that is within that VDB. I want to kind of delete that so I don't have them anymore, so they are not intersecting in anything. Converting them to line just to making sure I've got unique paths, and then I'm able to delete very small vines with this labs node, grouping the roots. Very simple. You can just use the vertex prim. So whatever is as the first prim num, that will be my root, and I'm using this to pin it in the Vellum sim. This is pretty cool too. What's going on here? I'm just doing like kind of secondary detail on these vines, and then I'm just randomly picking points on each curve, and I'm copying another section of little lines onto them. So now I've got these little off-hanging points, which I will be then, in the sim, it looks like they're actually growing and forking off a little bit. And another cool thing, I'm resampling here on the left-hand side the original points, creating a twist group, which is 25% of all of these guys. You can see they are highlighted in orange. And then I'm just sweeping them, creating ribbons around them to create these intertwined vines. Then it's a group promotion here, and we bring it all together, and now we've got forked and twisted vines in all of this. Cleaning it up just to get rid of all the unneeded attributes. I'm just setting the name based on the island name because I have a couple to loop over. I just wanted to make sure it's a unique name on each of these vines. Merging everything in and then packing everything. This is my starting point for the sim. You can see this is now all the points, all the vines outside and not intersecting, hopefully. Then I'm doing a lineup, which I need to do to, let me actually show what I mean by that. If I go do everything, it will also do the other one now. And then what the lineup is doing is just placing these next to each other. So it's easier to sim them. You can see I can actually move the gap and offset all the pieces. Then I'm unpacking them, splitting them based on collider geo and sim geo, which is this one. And then I'm just fading it into my vellum sim. This is obviously just set in cloth. I actually don't know why I use cloth. Normally I would use hair, but I guess it just worked out the same way. I use the roots to pin, and then in here is my vellum sim. I can just hit let's go initiated, and it sets everything up. And if I now hit play, you will see every vine is actually now falling down until it's actually stuck and nicely to the geo. And I did that one time, did a time shift here. Oh, this is just a wind animation. It's essentially the same fork. We just did secondary animation on them. If I dive in here, you will see that there's just a pop force with a pop wind, and that's all. It's just essentially a little bit of a X direction wind. And then at the end, I'm just getting everything after it's being simmed with some pre-roll. And yeah, that's the simulation of these vines. And the roots is also fairly simple. Let me just go all the way up here. Starting out with my base geo, what I'm doing here using Labs random selection node, it just randomly selects points. Yeah, maybe it's just too subtle, but it does select 40 random points and 40 random other points, which I just named end and start. And then I'm using find shortest path that points to start and end. And then based off that, it just creates me these connections. Resampling it, doing a mountain sub to just create a little bit of noise on it so it's just not super straight. And polywire. And that's the gist of the roots. But yeah, I can adjust the resample probably a little bit. But yeah, so that's how we did the roots, like kind of wrapping around the island. And all of these are just loading, are just there to render everything, right? They're just loading in the files on disk. The lighting there's not much to say about lighting. It's essentially a couple of distant lights from this angle, blasting it, and I've got some soft lighting. I can show the comp in a second as well, just to maybe visualize that a little bit better. And then they each have their own light group, $OS, which allows Arnold to know, or which just stores the node name as a light group. And then in the render AUVs, I can just have it automatically write each name into its own light group. Let me just show you the birds quickly. That's a little bit funny, probably. These are the birds I did, which are the distant birds in actually not sure what's going on there. So it's essentially a weird shape, and then they're just kind of floating. That's my birds. Like, they are really small. You can barely see them. They're in the distance, the blue points. And then Carson did a way better job with the foreground birdies. You can You can see they are actually looking like birds. Still very simple, but yeah, flapping their wings and all of that. So and this is what we just merged together. Right, so this is now the island water. So again, we're bringing in the same cliffs. What I'm doing here, I did draw this based on the top view where I kind of wanted to have water. And I'm just polyfilling it and then remeshing it. And then in the end, I'm just raying it back down. I wanted to kind of get a uniformly sized geo onto my water. You can see this is now the projected water. And then I'm just deleting very small points of this. And then I'm left with this kind of surface. Delete small parts to just get rid of the very fine sized geo. You can see now they get away. I'm removing them from that because these bigger holes are where the cliffs, the rocks are standing out, right? And what's going on in this compile block, I'm just measuring essentially a height attribute based on where it is in space. So let me just check after the compile. So you can see now these are all flat surfaces, and before they were a little bit, bumpy. So I'm just getting the average height because water is essentially flat. It's just flattening it out. And then how do you get the water? Like, you can see there are lots of holes in it. Like, I didn't bother too much in fixing it. There was no need to because it's just of the distance where it is in space. How it works, we're using this ocean spectrum, and that is the ocean evaluate is then just transferring the ocean spectrum onto the water surface. you can see now we got actually some nice waves. And if I scrub, yeah, there you go. And it's just kind of displacing the surface based on this ocean spectrum. And then I'm getting some speed. And if I visualize the speed, you can now see everything that is going a little bit quicker. We wanted to create this white water on the surface, right? So we brought in our waterfalls, point falls, and unpacking them and creating like a hit attribute on them. So the hit is wherever the water surface, the waterfall hits the surface. And it just needs a little bit of caching time. So that's why it's sketched to disk. But you can see wherever these particles hit the surface, there's some movement, and then there's a subtle fade off of the water surface. And that is then being cached out to disk, right? And then for the waterfalls, I had my main surface and I painted where I wanted waterfalls to be placed, right? So I used a draw curve to just paint exactly like art directed where I wanted these waterfalls to be. This is doing on the right. I'm using this flow map, which generates these vectors on everything. And then it's essentially grooming it. And then I can use the hair tools to groom my velocity. So I want the water to obviously run over these cliffs and around these cliffs. And this is, you can just hit enter and groom where you want the velocities to go essentially. So I can really art direct the flow of water based on the flow map here. And this is then being transferred into my original points. And then based on the line, I'm deleting the mask. So this is the mask I draw, and then I'm just deleting it based on a certain distance. And then I'm making it a little bit thicker. And then I'm doing points from volume, which just generates me my initial particle sims. And then I'm transferring the velocity from the original points from the surface onto the pop points. You can see now they're all pointing in the right direction. Within here, I'm doing a flip sim. I can technically just, if I just want one for now, show you the process. There you go. Yeah, and that's kind of the water sim. You can see it's a little bit slow. In the end, just thinking about it, I could probably have gotten away with just using a pop sim instead of the flip sim, because the pop sims are just way, way, way quicker. Yeah, and then everything is cached out. It took some time, and then you got water using the velocity. And these are the waterfalls, which you can see on the island, which is looking like this. And the spray falls, the big ones here, they have been done very similar. Instead of the flip, I used a pop sim on those just because they are around 100 meters in size. So we had to do a lot of pre-roll to actually get them where we wanted them to go. All right, so now let's have a look at the final image, right? The final image is the comp. And I really enjoy doing composing because we have so much control in the final look, right? I really enjoy that. We also did some denoising, which makes it a little bit fuzzy or not as detailed anymore. It's using the Arnold noise denoiser. You can see we lose a little bit detail in the trees because they kind of seem to be noise. Otherwise, it's cleaning up the water a little bit better. All right, should we just do a before and after maybe? I actually don't know. So let's just do Control-1. That's the island. And then I did a couple of things. Obviously, depth phasing. This is just, it makes more sense when we see the background. You can see I did some little hackery to get the waterfalls looking a lot nicer because there was a little bit harsh intersection. It's mainly depth phasing and a little bit of grading. Then obviously here is the defocus section where we are just in the foreground and then we're transitioning to the background. That's going on here. Cloud work, I did some light wrapping to just make them integrate better, some glow on them, distortion, just to distort everything on the edges, a little bit of glow, but I'll go again in a little bit more detail about everything. So how did we do the background? Let's talk about this first. So this, in the end, is a fully generated background from Midjourney. It was really fun to do, like lots of prompting, and this is now 4K, and you wonder how did we get 4K? I found a different website which actually upscales it and adds more detail where it's needed to be. Yeah, and then it's all, I sharpen it a little bit, put that onto a sphere like that, and then our shot camera looks in the sphere, lives inside the sphere, doing a scanline render. This is now our view from the camera. And the cool thing now is if we move, the camera kind of moves also, like offsets the image when the camera moves. You can see now everything moves with it. It's pretty nice. Very easy to make these kind of looking depth images. Defocus is linked to my plate defocus, to my CG defocus, so it's all synced up. And then it's just a merge A over B in the end here. This setup here at the top is just to get some more detail on these waterfalls. So I'm using PMAT, which is an object-based matting system. I blurred it just to pick a certain location. And then what is this crypto mat? This crypto mat is just picking up all the water surfaces. I'm just desaturating it a little and giving it some highlights, which makes these edges a little bit more foam looking. Grading based on the input mask just to get a little bit more texture in there. And then the same at the bottom just to get a little bit more. This is just a little bit of a hackery. Picking the waterfalls. Let's see what we did here. Oh, I just made this one at the back a little bit transparent, so actually we can see through the background of it. So what's going on? I'm just picking the depth map, grading it. You can see now there's a, but based on this, I'm just grading them a little bit, like just lifting the blacks essentially. Getting some depth in here. These are the birds, hard to see, but they are there because they are black, they are hard to see. Birds are just, I think I graded them slightly just to make them a little bit more visible. Yeah, so the clouds got a little bit more treatment because I wanted to match them to the plate clouds because they are very fluffy and kind of, yeah, velvety looking. So if I wouldn't have done all these overrides, you can see the clouds would be a little bit wide and strong. So I just balance them in to get them in the warm kind of space. And let's have a quick look of all the water stuff here. The water itself is a little bit noisy denoise. You can see there's like, it's very grainy. So the denoiser is kind of blurring everything a little bit, but I think it looks a little bit better than just the noisy particles. So I copied the Z passes over. I changed a little bit of grading on the right-hand side on the plants, I guess, made them a little bit darker. Did some auto cropping. It just speeds up. It does like the automatic bounding box around your geo. This is the final result. And I did some chromatic, which is just a little bit of edge breakups. Essentially, I guess just separating the RGB channels. See, it just makes it a little bit more camera-like. Did some grain on it. Then where is always a good idea. And then writing it out as a JPEG sequence. And then, so yeah. I hope this was cool. I hope the breakdown was a lot more detailed. As I said, all the scene files that I showed today will be available on my Patreon. And the Nuke file as well. Karsten and I, we have a SpeedTree HDA, which is available on Gumroad, which allows you to animate your trees in a procedural manner so you don't have to cache them out. So all of these trees are actually moving. You can see that here, they're actually nicely and swaying. You can get that on Gumroad, the link will be in the description below. And also the ivy for the vines, which has been also used for The Last of Us. That is also in the description below if you want to get some nice old kind of overgrown buildings and whatever. So again, thank you everyone for watching. It was a little bit longer than expected, but I wanted to give you all the details. So again, support me on Patreon to get the scene files, and probably I'll see you on my Discord server. Thank you.